It's May of 1861, just a few weeks after the Confederates have opened fire on Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina, marking the beginning of the Civil War. 7 states have seceded from the Union, and by the time the month is over, 2 more will join them. The nation is divided against itself and threatening to implode. Soldiers from the North are marching towards soldiers from the South, where they'll meet in the middle at bloody battlefields spanning hundreds of miles and hundreds of thousands of deaths. It's a scary time to be an American, and the cold, hard realities of a long and gruesome war should be all anyone is thinking about. But in Boston, they're preoccupied with something else. A new sport with ancient roots only recently imported from Europe. In Massachusetts, the summer of 1861 would be remembered as the beginning of the Civil War, but it would also be remembered as the time when New England discovered croquet. By September, newspapers were reporting on croquet matches, calling the game the rage of the summer throughout Boston and telling of its spread throughout the East Coast. 5 years later, the croquet obsession that swept over the American Northeast finally arrived in the Midwest. By the time it landed in St. Joseph County, the Civil War was over, and South Bend had just celebrated its first birthday as an incorporated city. The first mention of croquet in local newspapers appeared on July 19, 1866, and it wouldn't be long until croquet mania took over the entire state. Croquet clubs even appeared throughout South Bend, and the St. Joseph Valley Register even penned a poetic ode to the sport in 1869. A painter must that poet be, and lay with brightest hues his palette, who'd be the bard of croquet-ry, and sing the joys of hoop and mallet. Given all these, and I proclaim, by fortune friendly or capricious, whether you win or lose the game, you'll find that croquet is delicious. Hey, I didn't say it was a good poem. Anyway, besides inspiring bad poetry, croquet also inspired intermarital assaults, like when a woman in Clayton, Indiana clubbed her husband with a croquet mallet because she was frustrated with his poor play, or when a woman in Boonville, Indiana clubbed her fiancé over the head with a croquet mallet because she was frustrated with his poor play, putting him into what was then called a brain fever. The Boonville couple were wed as soon as the man recovered. Croquet was a sport that stirred passions, and violent passions at that, and maybe that's the moment when a pair of business-minded South Benders recognized that there was money to be made off the craze. In 1874, with croquet still thriving, a woodworker named John Teal and an entrepreneur named Frederick Badet went into the wood-turning business together. They couldn't have known it then, but during the next 100 years, their firm would produce more than 10 million croquet sets, more than any other company in the United States. The firm also didn't have a proper name yet, but it would soon enough. They'd call it the South Bend Toy Manufacturing Company. Hello and welcome to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum in South Bend. I'm your host, Aaron Helman, and during this series, we're going to dive into some of the fun and forgotten businesses of South Bend, running the gamut from toys to bait to underwear to newspapers. During the course of this episode, you'll hear fictional advertisements for very real historical companies and products. We do that to help break up the podcast, provide some levity, to include just a little more history than we could otherwise, and to give you a sense of the time and place when and where all of this is happening. The absence of actual paid advertisements is made possible by the generous underwriting of the entire series by Andy and Tina Nickel of South Bend. And now, with all of that out of the way, let's jump into the South Bend Toy Manufacturing Company. And the first thing that you need to know about this little endeavor is that the company's founders, John Teal and Frederick Badet, never intended to start a toy company. John Teal was a highly skilled wood turner, and if you've ever turned wood before, you know that it's incredibly difficult, incredibly labor-intensive, and incredibly dangerous. And with the technology of the 1870s, it was all of those things, and even more so. Teal had been in the wood-turning business with a fellow called Slick since 1871, but on October 19, 1874, he dissolved that partnership and went into business with Badet. The two leased a small space on the East Race at the Huey Chair Factory, and if the oft-repeated legend is to be believed, they had a workplace that measured just 15 square feet. They set to work as wood turners, and besides making croquet sets, they also made chairs and table legs, stairway banisters, and miscellaneous parts as needed for the South Bend Waterworks. They also made wooden dumbbells and wooden Indian clubs, an old piece of exercise equipment that is not dissimilar from a modern kettlebell. The only common denominator in their earliest product lines was that they made things from hardwood that could be turned and treated in their tiny shop. By the end of their first year in business, Teal and Badet had generated $7,000 in sales, almost $200,000 in today's money. They had 7 employees, and again, if you believe the legend, exactly 15 square feet for those employees to work out of. That's probably why they opened a separate paint and varnish shop at Taylor and Division Streets in 1875, and then in 1876, moved their entire operation to a larger space inside the South Bend Furniture Factory building. An 1877 South Bend Tribune article recounted the success of the firm, noting that croquet was the most widely popular game on the continent, noting that it was a peculiar delight to youthful couples who love each other all the way from puppy love to distraction, but haven't yet owned the fact to each other except through the medium of soulful glances. The article keeps going. A season of croquet is almost certain to bring matters to a focus and prepare the way to forge the links that only death or a divorce lawyer can sever. But we digress. The article also talks about the process of making the croquet sets: ash wood for the handle, apple wood for the heads, and maple wood for the balls. Teal and Badet were fortunate to be in South Bend in 1877. With nearby access to plenty of hardwood trees in a city with a healthy manufacturing ethos and railroads that connected it to every place on the continent. At the same time, they still considered themselves first and foremost a wood-turning operation, manufacturing broom handles and table legs besides the croquet sets. But the big money was in those croquet sets, and their business grew exponentially, selling 3,500 sets in 1875, 7,000 in 1876, 15,000 in 1877, 20,000 in 1878, 40,000 in 1879, and 75,000 sets in 1880. In 6 years, Teal and Badet had increased their croquet sales by a factor of 20. And that's when they stopped making table legs. Of course, that didn't mean they were only making croquet sets, and that was a good business decision too. Just 2 years after the Tribune called croquet the biggest sport on the continent, it had been supplanted by another, trendier sport. Fortunately for the partnership, the new hot sport was one that was going to require a lot of wood turning. Teal and Badet were about to make a fortune selling baseball bats. By 1879, they were provably the largest manufacturer of croquet sets in the country, and they claimed to be the largest manufacturer of baseball bats in the world. If there was a larger one out there, I couldn't find it, and Louisville Slugger wouldn't get started for another 5 years. 1880 was just 5 years away from the start of the company, but Teal and Badet were on top of the world, selling 50,000 baseball bats, 75,000 croquet sets, running a staff of 50 employees, and signing a deal with Studebaker to make children's wagons and carts that would carry the Studebaker name. By the end of 1882, they would be the largest manufacturer of croquet sets, baseball bats, and children's wagons on the entire planet. It was only then that Teal and Bedette made up their minds to become a full-on toy company, incorporating as the South Bend Toy Manufacturing Company on January 3, 1883, and taking Will Carskadden on as a third partner. The new company quickly established itself as a major player in the city of South Bend, and did all of the things that the other major South Bend businesses did in the 1880s, like starting a company baseball team and watching its factory burn to the ground. We'll catch up on both of those things right after the break.
Stop by Adler Brothers to stock up on holiday presents including mufflers, sealskin caps, silk umbrellas, smoking jackets, fashionable neckwear, and linen hem-stitched handkerchiefs. Best of all, boys will receive a free toy gun with each and every suit and overcoat sold. Only at Adler Brothers at 107 Michigan Street. And now, back to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum.
The baseball teams of South Bend's industrial leagues were legendary in the 1930s and 1940s, often stealing the front pages of the sports section away from the goings-on in the American and National Leagues. But those teams had roots all the way back in the 1880s, during a time when baseball looked a lot different than it does now, or than it did in the 1930s. Pitchers tossed underhand. Gloves were barely mittens if they were worn at all. They did have bats, and in 1887, those bats were most likely provided by the newest team in the Industrial League, the South Bend Toy Company. For the next 60 years, the South Bend Toy Company would show up more often in newspapers as a baseball team than as a South Bend company. But it would absolutely show up in the papers as a company on December 29, 1887, when the factory burned to the ground. By now, the Tribune took care to note, the South Bend Toy Company was bigger than its next two competitors combined, but it would appear that the Flames did not respect or care for the company's market share. The fire was started by a careless employee named Chris Louser, who placed a rag, saturated with turpentine, on a shovel and thrust it into a stove, then, repelled by the intense heat, jerked it out and threw it blazing furiously among the flammable material in the wheel room. I do not know why Louser did any of these things, but given that the toy company worked primarily in wood and lacquer, the place went up in a hurry. The firefighters did everything they could, which, given the situation, wasn't much. The building was totaled in just a few hours. The South Bend Toy Company now had a decision to make. It had already purchased land for a new, larger factory at 1012 High Street that was supposed to open 9 months later. It could choose to cease operations until the new facility was complete, or it could hastily rebuild its torched facility to return to production as quickly as possible. The company chose the second option, rebuilding the burnt building and operating out of it for half a year before moving into the shiny new facility on High Street, and not a moment too soon. By 1889, South Bend Toy was receiving orders for wagons from individual purchasers, 100,000 at a time. It employed 25 people, and Clem Studebaker declared it to be the largest toy maker in the world. I've looked into it, and while I can't definitively prove the statement to be true, I can't find anything that would prove it to be false. If South Bend wasn't the capital of the toy building world in 1889, it was certainly one of them, and it was about to get even bigger. During the 1890s, South Bend Toy was no longer among the leaders in baseball bat production, but it would ship more than 1 million croquet sets during the decade. It would maintain its dominance as the largest producer of children's wagons, and when it started making doll carriages, it rocketed to the top of that category as well. Business increased year over year throughout the 1890s and into the 1900s. There wasn't a lot of ingenuity in its product catalogs during these years, but there didn't need to be. The population of the United States was growing, and the birth rate was through the roof. The market for children's toys was exploding, and wouldn't you know it, the sport of croquet was experiencing something of a resurgence too. The South Bend Toy Manufacturing Company was in the midst of a stretch in which it would experience its best sales year ever, one year after another, after another, after another. In 1911, the company's toys were advertised in a 90-page catalog, several models of croquet sets, plenty of children's wagons and doll carriages, a whole line of juvenile furniture perfect for kids' rooms and classrooms. In 1914, John Teal, the woodworker who started the whole thing, finally retired from the company, still considered the largest toy maker in the United States. He sold his share of the company to Baudette, and Teal would die a year later. As for Baudette, he looked optimistically toward the many years to come, even as war brewed in Europe. Baudette expected the war years to be among the best for his company, rationalizing that since Germany produced more toys than any other country in the world, there would be a growing market for non-German toys amidst the Kaiser's aggressions. He might have been right about that part, but he underestimated the way World War I would affect the local economy. South Bend Toy did fine during these years, but it did not break any records. Still, it could have been much worse. When the wartime fuel shortage forced the closure of factories across the nation, including 270 of 275 factories in St. Joseph County, South Bend Toy was among the few permitted to remain open. Its products were considered necessary to maintaining the nation's morale. South Bend Toy also benefited from a national shift in attitudes toward children, toys, and especially Christmas shopping. Even Santa got into the promotion of the firm, and the Tribune noted that South Bend Toy filled a pretty big prescription for old St. Nick, including gay little stick horses, coaster wagons, rocking horses, roller coasters, doll carriages, miniature farm wagons, wheelbarrows, carts, chairs, tables, cedar chests, shoe-fly rockers, and shoot-the-chutes. South Bend Toy continued to grow, and when South Bend Chilled Plow, not to be confused with the Oliver Chilled Plow Works, was bought out by an Evansville company in 1925, South Bend Toy took that factory over too. In 1926, South Bend Toy also had a company basketball team, dropping what must have been a thrilling contest to the Bendix squad by a score of 10-9. In 1936, the South Bend Toy baseball squad experienced one of its greatest moments in South Bend's long and storied baseball history when Louis Kraska hurled 9 innings of no-hit ball against a stacked Oliver team. In news about the actual company, and not just its athletic ventures, South Bend Toy experienced a painful strike that shuttered the factory for 3 weeks in 1937. In 1940, Frederick Baudette retired from the company after more than 60 years at the helm. For the first time in its history, the firm would have a new man in its president's chair. Frank Chrisman took over for Baudette during what would become the most challenging years in the company's history, and maybe the most challenging years in the history of human civilization. When we come back from the break, South Bend Toy becomes an essential part of World War II.
Modernize your kitchen right now with the beautiful Magic Chef gas range from the Northern Indiana Public Service Company, but you might know us better by our acronym NIPSCO. A Magic Chef gas range from NIPSCO has all the features you want on a liberal payment plan of just $2.85 per month. Inquire at 307 Michigan Street. And now, back to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum.
The first year of Frank Chrisman's tenure as president of the South Bend Toy Manufacturing Company started on a strange note when he announced on April 3rd that the company would begin making that beloved children's plaything, laundry hampers. It ended on a somber note when the War Department contracted his company to produce $39,000 worth of tent poles. During the coming years, South Bend Toy would be brought further into the war effort, harnessing its long pedigree as a master wood-turning facility and being called to produce billy clubs for military police on bases across the world. But just like it had been during World War I, the primary work of South Bend Toy was protected. Its doll carriages were declared absolutely essential to the morale of the nation, and it was permitted to continue in the toy business alongside its wartime contributions. In 1942, Christman announced that its production was about 50-50 between wartime goods and toys. It was also during this time that the toy company became the most dangerous place in South Bend to work. Wood turning is plenty dangerous now, even with modern methods and equipment. In 1940, when technology was lacking, and when the factory was turning to inexperienced and untrained employees to make up the slack for the workers who'd gone out to war, South Bend Toy might have seemed like a battlefield. Rosie the Riveter might have thrived in Detroit, but at South Bend Toy she might have lacerated a kidney. South Bend Toy employees were immolated, mutilated, crushed, burned, dismembered, and blinded. They took timber kickbacks to the crotch, plummeted down elevator shafts, and sliced tendons. They lost fingers, punctured lungs, and were maimed by the exploding shrapnel of failing equipment pushed past its limit. All of it was reported regularly in the newspapers, and all of it was the result of unseasoned employees working beyond their expertise on equipment beyond its lifetime in support of a war that needed to be won. Things calmed down at the war's end, and so far as I can tell, for all of the injuries at the toy company, no one ever died there. By 1950, Christman had seen the company through a transition into war, a term of 10 years that must have seemed like 20. He announced his retirement and was replaced by Badette's son, who himself would only serve a term of 2 years before being replaced by Robert Measle in 1952. By 1952, South Bend Toys' catalog hadn't changed. It made doll buggies, kids' furniture, and croquet sets. The newspapers only called them one of the largest toy manufacturers in the world, but South Bend Toy would claim each of the next 8 years as the most profitable in the history of the company. By the end of the 1950s, South Bend Toy had sales offices in Los Angeles, Seattle, Nashville, and Toronto, in addition to a shiny flagship office on Fifth Avenue in New York City. Its CEO, Robert Measle, was named President of the Toy Manufacturers of the United States of America. After nearly 80 years, it might have seemed that South Bend Toy was still on top of the world, and maybe it was, but there was also some cause for concern. In 1957, the Badette family sold its shares of the company to Benjamin Foreman, a Chicago industrialist who would later liquidate the South Bend Bait Company, as well as a local tool and die shop. By 1959, Foreman had struck a deal to make South Bend Toy a division of Play School. But that didn't mean South Bend Toy was over. Despite the new arrangement with Play School, it kept its name and so did its products. In fact, South Bend Toy would go on to acquire a pair of companies for its own, Keystone Wood Toys out of New Jersey and Lou Erbach Inc., a manufacturer of pools and skating rinks. All of it was a feather in the cap of Robert Measle, who went out on top after another record year and handed the reins of the company over to Louis Christ, a longtime employee of the company and the best tennis player in South Bend. Christ oversaw South Bend Toy in 1960, the first year in 8 that did not deliver new sales records. Christ managed the company through an economic slowdown in the first half of that decade, but by 1965, the firm was once again breaking sales records year after year after year. When Milton Bradley bought out Play School in 1968, it didn't even register as a blip at South Bend Toy Company. South Bend Toy broke a record that year, and the next one. In 1970, it shipped more than 90 million toys. And in 1972, it won the Sears and Roebuck Symbol of Excellence as the highest quality toy maker in the world, even if it wasn't necessarily the largest. That same year, the city of South Bend sold $1.6 million in bonds to help the South Bend Toy Company remodel and relocate to a new facility at 3300 West Sample Street. It moved into the new building on September 10, 1973. It won the Sears Award again. A year after that, South Bend Toys celebrated its 100th anniversary and won the Sears Award a third time. A year after that, it launched the TV show Celebrity Tennis to help push its new lawn tennis game. Participants on the show included Robert Stack, Lloyd Bridges, and Bob Newhart. The company also won its fourth consecutive Sears Award. In 1976, Christ retired, but South Bend Toy won its fifth Sears Award. In 1977, it won its sixth. And in 1978, South Bend Toy won its seventh such award in a row. I don't mean to spoil the ending of this episode for you, but by the end of 1978, South Bend Toy had experienced record profits for 9 of the past 12 years and had won the highest honor in its field each of the previous 7. And it was just 3 years from going out of business. Cheaper competition from overseas had been a disaster for the business of South Bend Toy, a company that had competed on quality a lot more than price. The children's toy market was flooded with new tech and new fads, and the problem with technology is that you don't need a high-tech device to be long-lasting when its technology will be outdated in a year or two anyway. The toy industry was no longer about building durable wagons that would last for generations. It was about finding a shiny thing and making as much money off of it as you could before the next shiny thing came along to replace it. South Bend Toy tried to play that game for a little bit, winning a contract to produce Star Trek toys around the release of the first Star Trek movie in 1979. But it was too late. Rumors about closing the factory began in 1980, but were forestalled by layoffs and reorganizations by the end of the year. Those rumors were fully realized by the end of 1981. South Bend Toys' workforce was down to 125 by that year, and in December the factory was closed, and most of them were out of jobs. But not all of them. Before the company was completely parted out, South Bend Toys general manager John Bycraft bought out the firm's croquet line, the endeavor that started it all and South Bend Toys' most enduring legacy. Even as the company had declined, it remained, as it always had been, the largest maker of croquet sets in the United States. Bycraft started a new company, this one called South Bend Toy Incorporated. He built the new venture entirely around the manufacturing of croquet sets. It was a terrible idea. During the 1980s, the popularity of croquet was eclipsed by literally every other sport. No one wanted to buy croquet sets, and if they did, the secondary market was saturated with millions of South Bend Toy croquet sets that were so well made that they were practically as good as new, even if they were 40 or 50 years old. On June 19, 1985, South Bend Toy Incorporated announced it would cease all operations. The South Bend Toy Manufacturing Company occupied many buildings during the years, but its facilities at Huey Chair, South Bend Furniture, and on High Street have all been razed. The facility at 3300 Sample Street remains and is home to the South Bend Chocolate Company factory. Hey, thanks for joining us on A Bend in Time presented by the History Museum in South Bend. There's more history waiting for you at historymuseumsb.org. I'm your host, Aaron Helman. The theme music is Whose Distance Is It Anyway by Neil Carmichael. Thanks to Andy and Tina Nickel for underwriting this episode and all 8 episodes in this series. Our next episode in the Forgotten Businesses series will cover the A.C. Staley Woolen Manufacturing Company and Stevenson Underwear Mills. I hope you'll tune in for that one next. Until then, keep learning new things, and remember, everything is fascinating as long as you stay curious.